Hi, and welcome to the Right to Remain Silent podcast. I'm Jim Weber, your host and guide through actual accounts of intriguing and fascinating true crime stories as told by the law enforcement professional that experienced the event. The Right to Remain Silent podcast makes no exaggeration of fact, doesn't glamorize details, or sensationalize reality. The format here is basic. Real stories from real cops. Lastly, please don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, and share. Doing this will help me continue to provide you, the listener, with captivating and relevant true crime stories. Now, let's listen in on today's episode. Hi, and welcome to today's episode of the Right to Remain Silent True Crime Podcast. Today's guest is retired DEA Special Agent Chris Feistl, one of the lead investigators assigned to Colombia during the takedown of the Cali Cartel, the criminal organization that rose to power after the fall of Pablo Escobar. His real-life work was portrayed in Season 3 of Netflix's Narcos, where he was featured as one of the central characters. Chris brings firsthand insight into international drug trafficking investigations, high-stakes operations, and what really happened behind the scenes. Chris also has a book release coming out this June, I believe June 24th, and the book is called After Escobar. Chris, welcome, and I really look forward to our conversation today.
Hey, Jim, it's great to be with you and your listeners today. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yep, absolutely. Well, let me kick things off here. Maybe we set the stage for our conversation, and I just kind of read your bio so listeners are familiar with who you are and kind of where you're coming from as we talk about your story today. Is that all right?
Absolutely.
All right, here we go. Chris served with distinction for 26 years with the Drug Enforcement Administration, retiring in 2014 as an assistant special agent in charge of the Phoenix Division. After serving an initial 6-year assignment in Miami, Florida, Chris was sent to Colombia in July 1994 and assigned to a special task force created to take down the notorious Cali Cartel, a cartel former head of the DEA, Robert Bonner, once called the most powerful criminal organization in the world. No drug organization rivals them in history. In Colombia, Chris partnered with Dave Mitchell, and together they spent almost 3 years investigating the cartel. Their joint efforts resulting in the arrest of the 4 ruthless Cali godfathers and the dismantlement of the biggest drug cartel in history. During his DEA career, Chris worked all over the world, including over 12 years in Colombia, one of the longest tenures ever served by a DEA agent in that country. While assigned to Colombia, Chris managed and directed some of DEA's most significant investigations, from transnational organized crime groups like the Cali and North Valley cartels to designated foreign terrorist organizations such as the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. Chris has long been considered an expert on the Cali Cartel, consistently making him a highly sought-after guest on television documentaries and podcasts with a particular focus on his pursuit of the Cali Cartel leaders. Chris is a recipient of the DEA Administrator's Award of Honor, DEA's highest honor, the DEA's Administrator's Award for Exceptional Service twice, the DEA Administrator's Award for Outstanding Group Achievement, 8 DEA Performance Awards, various recognition awards from the U.S. intelligence community and other federal agencies, and 4 Distinguished Service Medals from the Colombian government. Chris currently serves as a consultant, subject matter expert, and advisor on television and film projects, including Season 3 of Narcos, which chronicled Chris and Dave's efforts against the cartel. Chris, that's an incredible bio.
Thank you.
Well, let's start off with this. Let me ask you, why did you get into law enforcement and specifically what drew you to DEA?
Well, it's a funny story because it was actually pretty much by accident. And the summer of my junior year in college, I was 20 years old, and I had a bunch of my friends who said, "Hey, we should go down to the shore, go down to the beach for the summer and hang out and have a little bit of fun." So we rented a house down there, but of course, if you're living by the beach and you're doing a little surfing, you got to have some money, right? So we had to find jobs to kind of support our habits and our pastimes. So while I was there looking for a job, we asked around, and a couple of people said, "Hey, you should go to the municipal building because I know they're hiring lifeguards and special or seasonal police officers." And I wasn't quite sure what that meant, so we went to the municipal building, and they said, "Yeah, during the summer, at a lot of these beach towns in New Jersey and in Maryland, they hire what they call special or seasonal police officers." And because you were in law enforcement too, it's pretty crazy back then. Is you went to a 1 week, 40-hour training academy where they gave you the background on New Jersey state statutes and laws, and you also qualified with a weapon. So after 1 week, we were trained, we were carrying guns, and they unleashed us to the beach to enforce those laws. And as you can imagine, in the summertime in those beach communities, the population swells. You have all kind of tourists and everybody visiting for the summer. And one night after work, when I was out, I was at a bar for your listeners who are familiar with New Jersey and Wildwood. There was a bar back then. It was pretty popular called the Fairview. And I was in there and I got approached by a young girl. And I was 20 at the time, actually, so I wasn't even allowed to drink. So I was in there and she asked me, we had a conversation, and she asked me if I wanted to buy some methamphetamine. So, I wasn't really quite sure what to do. So I went back to the real police and the real narcs in Wildwood and kind of set up this little undercover meeting and deal. And that really sparked my interest in law enforcement because initially I wanted to go to law school. And, after that undercover meeting and the deal, I started looking into DEA, FBI, CIA, Secret Service. And, the more I looked into it, the more I had an interest in DEA, their foreign operations, being able to travel a lot. So that's really what kind of got me on that path to being in law enforcement.
Okay. That sounds like a dream first job, actually.
Yeah. So after I graduated from college, I got a job as a full-time, like I was a real police officer then in Virginia
You
Beach.
stepped up. Okay.
That's right. Yeah, Virginia Beach, Virginia. So I did that summer gig for 3 summers, which was really great. It was a great experience. I learned a lot, taught me a lot. So then I applied. I just kept trying to work my way further down the beach community, a little further south. So I ended up in Virginia Beach. I worked there for a year and a half. While I was there, I had applied to DEA, and I was basically just waiting for DEA to call me.
Okay. And then at some point, DEA contacts you, you're hired, right? And then you go through the academy and then you get your initial assignment, right?
That's right.
Where did you end up initially once you graduated from the academy, and what was your first duty station once you got out?
So when I was in Quantico, Virginia, which is where the DEA Academy was, DEA didn't have their own academy at the time, so we went to the FBI Academy. And the way that they did it back then is you submitted kind of like a wish list, and you put the 5 places that you wanted to go. It didn't guarantee that you were going to go there. It's basically, where they needed the most help. And my 5 choices were Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm, Tampa, and Fort Myers. So I think they got the picture that I wanted to go to South Florida. I grew up in Pennsylvania, so I can't stand the cold weather. I wanted to keep migrating further south, Jersey, Virginia Beach, finally Miami. And, when I was in the process of, making that decision as to where I wanted to go. It was late. I went to the academy in 1988. So Miami was the home of the cocaine cowboys. It was the home of Miami Vice, right? Miami Vice had put a whole new spotlight on South Florida. And at the time, that was one of the top places to work if you wanted to be a DEA agent. So I said, hey, if I really want to be a DEA agent, I got to go to South Florida, to the home of Miami Vice and the Cocaine Cowboys, and start my career there, because what a better place to go. It had warm weather, it had great fishing and diving, pristine beaches, great restaurants, beautiful women, and it was, in my mind, the place to go to learn the job the fastest, right? Because you get exposed to all kind of investigations and cases in that South Florida area. So I wanted to go somewhere that was busy, where I could learn the job as quickly as possible and be, in that hot spot.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So once you're in Miami there, it's essentially, like you said, you're working everything. It's essentially you're thrown directly into it. And I'm guessing you're working, like you said, every type of case there is. And, I've worked with guys that were assigned down there in Miami as well. And it sounds like the work can be 24/7, 365.
It pretty much was at that time. And, Miami kept sending agents there because of all the activity that was going on. So my senior partner was an agent by the name of Alex Dominguez, who had 10 months more on the job than I did. So that's how we learned. We made a lot of mistakes. They basically said, go out there, do your job, figure it out, kind of thing. So that's pretty much what we did. But there were no shortage of cases in Miami. We used to always say that cocaine was falling out of the sky, and literally, at sometimes it was, because of the all the air activity there. So you can work any kind of investigation in Miami pretty much that you wanted. There were heroin cases, there were crack cases, there were marijuana importation cases, cocaine smuggling investigations, wiretaps, conspiracies. And anybody, I'm sure your friends will tell you the same thing, that at that time in the late 80s and early 90s, Miami was just being inundated with Colombian cocaine. So it made for a time that you were working 24/7.
Yeah. Yeah. And I never worked there, but it sounds like from what you're saying and everything I've heard, it was a historical time in law enforcement and the drug trade in that area in that time frame.
It most absolutely was, because, look at just Miami geographically, right? It's one of the closest entry points for the Colombian cartels and some of the other drug trafficking organizations to import their cocaine, plus, and marijuana for that matter. And Miami has 1,350 miles of coastline, so it was pretty easy to get stuff in there at that time.
Yeah. Yeah. And back then, there wasn't the technology available that there is today to monitor those coastlines and those borders. So that had to be an incredible, just incredible working experience. So you're there in Miami, crash course in working investigations. I'm assuming you get your feet underneath you, you figure out what you're doing, and then at that point, do you kind of develop an interest in any certain type of investigation or group while you're in Miami? Or, I guess my question is, how did you kind of walk down the path towards the Cali Cartel? Did it start in Miami?
It did. And through my partner Alex Dominguez and Dave Gaddis and AD Wright, a couple guys that we worked with back then, we started to get a lot of pretty good informants that had intelligence about the smuggling organizations that were bringing the cocaine into the U.S. And as a result, I got involved in doing a lot of maritime smuggling investigations, where these organizations in Colombia, i.e., the Cali Medellin cartels, two of the things that they always had issues with were, one of which was transportation, right? Getting drugs into the country and getting money out were always problems and vulnerabilities for these cartels. So they were always looking for, new routes and new transportation networks, new pilots, new boat captains, so on and so forth. So we were able to recruit a couple of sources that had access to this. And over time, we developed a pretty good network that we had in Miami with DEA. We had undercover boats. We had access to undercover coastal freighters. We had undercover houses down in the Florida Keys. And as a result of that, I began working quite a few of these international maritime smuggling investigations, which focused on, peripheral elements of the Cali and Medellin cartel. And that really piqued my interest into working, those major, larger types of investigations tied back to Cali. And, also during that time too, I don't know if you would remember this, but there was a Time magazine expose written by acclaimed journalist Elaine Shannon. And on the cover, it had the four pictures of the Cali cartel leaders. And it said, the new kings of cocaine, the new kings of coke. This was in 1991. And, reading Elaine's article, I was like, oh my God, these guys are massive. Look at all the massive drug seizures, the money that they have, the resources, the power. And, the combination of those two things put me on that path where I said, I'm a DEA agent. I'm working in Miami, but if I want to be a real DEA agent, I got to go to Colombia. I got to go to the epicenter of the drug trade and go after these biggest, baddest cartels on the planet. So that's kind of what steered me down that path to working in Colombia.
It sounds like a natural progression for your career there as you describe it unfolding. And it makes sense that you would want to go do that. So, how long were you working in Miami before you actually went to Colombia, maybe for the first time? Did you do a temporary detail assignment there, or did you go directly to Colombia at some point? How did that experience unfold?
So I worked in Miami for 6 years prior to going to Colombia, and I didn't really have a chance to go TDY until just a very short time before I actually reported there. So, yeah, 6 years in Miami, and that kind of sprung me down to Colombia.
Okay. Could you could you talk about the process of, I'm assuming it's pretty competitive, to go to those international positions like that. What was the process like? Do you put in an application or, do you go through interviews to do that? How does that unfold? And then secondly, from the point you decide you want to go down there for real, how long does it take you to go through that process and get down there?
Good questions. So the process has evolved over the years, and it changes, from time to time. But for me, at the time when I applied, a couple of things. I'll give you a little background as well. So, working in Miami and working on a lot of those higher level investigations, everything traces back to Colombia, as well as some of the cells that they have in Central America or the Caribbean. So while we were in Miami working on these cases, we got to travel extensively. We traveled all through the Caribbean, all through Central America, and a couple different places in South America. So in dealing with those cases that tie back to Colombia too, you're continually coordinating with the agents who are permanently assigned in Colombia at that time. So because of the cases that we worked, the communication that we had, I knew a couple of the agents down there, and Miami was kind of a natural springboard for agents who wanted to go to Colombia and work because, as we said, a lot of those cases tie back into Colombia. So it's kind of a natural progression for agents to want to go and to be accepted to work in Colombia. So I had that going for me. And so when I applied, there's a couple of pictures on my website. I didn't get a real haircut for over 5 years, right? So I had hair down to the middle of my back. I had two earrings in one ear, another earring here, I had the facial growth. So I looked more like an extra or a surfer in Point Break than I did a DEA agent. So uh, initially I applied and I didn't get accepted. And I'm thinking to myself, I wonder why wouldn't I get accepted to Columbia? I had outstanding evaluations. I worked on a lot of high level cases. I knew some of the agents down there. Uh, I said, what's going on? So I made a call down there and I talked to one of my friends, actually Steve Murphy from, Narcos season 1 and 2. And he used to work in Miami before he went to Colombia. So we knew him from there, me and my partner, Dave. And he was like, dude, you got to get your hair cut. This is the embassy. It's a different environment. You can't roll around like you are in Miami with, no socks and long hair and earrings and stuff. Um, so I got my hair cut and I got a call, a few weeks later from the country attaché down there at the time, Joe Toft. And he said, hey, I heard you got your hair cut. And I said, yes, sir, I did. He goes, yeah, don't worry, keep putting in, things will work out for you. Just be patient. So,
Oh, that's
uh,
encouraging.
yeah. So, and like I said, because of the contact that we had with the agents and the investigations, they kind of knew a little bit about my background. So, you go through an interview process there with one of the supervisors, and they'll ask you about your background, if you speak Spanish, have you ever traveled before, what are some of the cases that you worked. So, I got accepted. Finally, I got selected, and from start to finish. It was probably maybe a little less than a year before I actually reported there. And I'll tell you why, because, and I got selected near the end of the fiscal year in the government, which meant,
Hmm.
the government was pretty much, DEA was out of money. So I had to wait until the following fiscal year, which was October 1st. And then before you actually report to a foreign country, depending on where you're going, whether it's Spanish speaking country in Central or South America, or another country in Europe that doesn't speak Spanish. You have to go to language school and you have to pass a language test before they will send you to the country that you're going to. So, hey, after we finally got the funding, then I had to go to language school for a few months. And then when you finish language school, you have to get medically cleared. Then you have to wait for transfer numbers. So it's a pretty lengthy process, which, if I had to guess at the time, probably now, maybe 9, 10 months, give or take, before I actually reported down there.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Like you said, anything with the government's going to take a while, right?
That's absolutely true.
So you get there, you get your feet on the ground in Colombia, and at that point, just before we start talking about your investigation, at that point, where do you live? Is housing provided for you by the embassy? How does that unfold for you?
Yes, you're assigned government quarters while you're there, which in Bogota, it depends on what country or what city that you're living in. In Bogota is like New York City, right? So there's not a lot of houses. Everything there is apartments. So you're assigned an apartment based on, the size of your family or whatnot. And that's how pretty much how you're assigned to live. So we lived in apartment buildings, which were pretty secure. Um, and again, it was just like living in downtown New York. A lot of traffic, a lot of people, 8+ million people in Bogota. So it's pretty hectic.
Okay. Yeah, I'm curious about this aspect. Do you correct me if I'm wrong? The book that you wrote it with Dave Mitchell. That's your partner, right? Or was your
Correct.
partner? Okay. Were you paired up with Dave prior to arriving in Colombia, or did that occur once you hit the ground in Colombia?
Coincidentally, Dave was hired 6 weeks before I was, and his first duty station along with mine was Miami. So while we
Okay.
were in the academy, he was one class ahead of me in the DEA academy, but we would see each other in the hallways or at lunchtime, and they have a little dive bar up there at the FBI academy called the boardroom. So any of the national academy guys or any of the other training that people do up there, they'll be familiar with the boardroom. So we'd meet over there, have a couple beers, have some pizza and stuff. So I knew Dave from the academy, and then we both got assigned to Miami as well. So we didn't work together. We were in different groups, but we routinely see each other in the hallways or out, on the town, so to say, at night. So we did know each other, but we did not work together. We both got transferred to Bogota at just about exactly the same time. And once we got there, we were both assigned to work against the Cali Cartel. So when I got selected, and Dave too, Pablo Escobar was still alive. So I thought to myself, man, I'm going to Colombia at exactly the best time, because Pablo was still alive. The Medellin cartel was on the run, and it was being decimated daily, but it was still there, and so was Cali. So I thought, man, this is a great time to be there. I can work on both of the cartels while I'm there. But prior to me getting there, prior to starting language school, obviously Pablo was killed in December of 1993. So we were sent there to shore up the operations against Cali, because every resource pretty much in the US government, as well as every resource in the Colombian government, they were all focused on taking down Escobar. He was public enemy number one. He was a narco terrorist. He was the greatest outlaw at the time in the world. So pretty much every resource available was spent to go after Pablo. And as a result, the Cali group was lacking in personnel. And then once Pablo was killed, obviously everyone knew that the next step was going to be to go after the Cali cartel. So, we say in law enforcement, timing is everything, right? So I was able to have some good fortune and some good luck as to actually when I was in Miami, when I was in Colombia. So when we got there, we were assigned to work against Cali. That was our job.
Okay. And I'm assuming that once Pablo was killed, was there, I don't know how you would describe it. Was there like a vacuum effect or a power transition from the Medellin cartel to the Cali cartel stepping it up a bit? How did that dynamic at that time frame work? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. There wasn't a power vacuum at all, because if you look back in history with the Medellin cartel started its downfall, and when I say start, it was gradual. But in 1989, right, Pablo declares war against the government of Colombia, and Colombia declares war right back. Pablo's killing presidential candidates. He's blowing up the Avianca flight. He blew up the DAS building, which is equivalent to the FBI building. So as a result, there was a war between Escobar and the Colombian government. Rodriguez Gacha, one of the founding members of the Medellin cartel, was killed in December of 1989. The Ochoa brothers, the three of them, surrender in 1991. Carlos later had previously been arrested and extradited. So by 1991, by mid 91, Escobar is pretty much on an island, right? And this whole time, Cali was just taking over, taking over, taking over. So you can say that ascent for Cali really started in the late 80s and continued on through the early 90s to mid 95 when they were eradicated. But so the power that dynamic was pretty gradual for Cali, but they were already trafficking, hundreds of tons of cocaine to the US. But what did exist was an intelligence vacuum, right? Because as we said, every resource was going after Pablo. So
Mhm.
there weren't that many resources in Colombia investigating Cali. They weren't pursuing the leads. They did, sporadic stuff, but it didn't amount to much. The same with DEA. The resources were dedicated toward hunting down Pablo. So once Pablo went down, the focus shifted to Cali. There was kind of an intelligence vacuum as to, where these guys are at, what their businesses were doing, who are their associates. So we had to get in the game quick, and we had to, kind of figure out what we were doing very fast.
All right, that's a great explanation or description there. And before we roll up the sleeves and get into your actual casework and investigation down there, I'm curious, was there a difference in the philosophical approaches that each cartel had or operated under between the Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel? Just listening to you here briefly, it sounds like the Medellin cartel was very violent, narco terror, events, murders, incidents like that. Was it to that extent or that extreme with the Cali cartel, or were they a little less subdued and under the radar?
Exactly what you said. You provided a perfect explanation. The Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel were completely different. They were different in a lot of ways. First of all, as you said, Medellin, their weapon was violence, threats, intimidation, coercion. assassinations, kidnappings, right? That's how they
Hmm.
they tried to get everything accomplished down there. When the government tried to reinstitute extradition, that's what they did. They assassinated the Minister of Justice. They assassinated Luis Carlos Galan, a presidential candidate in 1989 that would have no doubt won the next presidential election. So they were blowing up the airliners, the DOS building. So they tried to accomplish their mission through just that violence, threats, and intimidation. And while they were doing that, Cali was sitting back on the sidelines and they were watching what was happening. And they saw how the government killed Rodriguez Gotcha. They saw that Carlos Slater had been extradited. They saw Pablo Escobar hunted down like a dog and killed on the top of a rooftop in Medellin. Cali did not want that. So their weapon of choice, it wasn't violence or threats or intimidation. It was to bribe, right? They thought far better to buy everybody, to pay off everybody and get what we want rather than to kill them. They didn't want that heat. They didn't want the pressure from the government of Colombia, and they certainly didn't want that U.S. pressure coming after them too, right? They saw what happened in Panama with Noriega. Some of them thought that that was a possibility that U.S. troops would come on the ground, and even though it was kind of far fetched, they didn't want
Sure.
any of that. That notoriety as being violent. They didn't want any association to that. So while all that was going on with Medellin, for those, as we said, from 88, 89, 90 into the early 90s, Cali was buying everybody. So by the time that US, the DEA, the CIA, the Colombian government, the police, the military started to go after Cali, they were so well insulated with corrupt officials, not only in the government, the politicians, but the police, the military, and other security forces, that it made it very, very hard to penetrate that network to go after these guys.
That's incredible. And that's something I'm going to ask you about a little bit further on into our conversation here. It just blows my mind the corruption that I've always heard about from, individuals like you that have worked down there. And just I can't imagine how difficult it makes it, but I'd like to discuss that a little bit further down the road here. I'd kind of like to turn it over to you, and kind of give the floor to you at this point. You're in Colombia, you've been assigned the Cali Cartel. Pablo's been killed. The focus is this group right now, and you're there to address it. Can you walk us through that, maybe from where you'd like to start to how it unfolded, and maybe the conclusion of it? And then I might maybe throw in a question or two as you progress through.
All right, well, that's a long story, so we'll
Yeah,
kind of go piece by piece here. So
sure.
so when Dave and I get to Colombia, the first thing that we do, we go in that same day as we reported the next day, and we said, "All right, we're here." We had worked on some cases while we were in Miami that we talked about that had ties back to Cali. We had some good assets and sources that we were working with. One of the sources that we were talking with in Miami was actually meeting with Gilberto Rodriguez and Miguel Rodriguez, two of the leaders of the Cali Cartel. So we said, hey, we have some pretty good leads that we've developed through one of our really good assets that we need to go to Cali to pursue these leads. And no sooner did we get those words out of our mouth than the bosses told us, we're not sending anybody to Cali right now. It's too dangerous. And Dave and I kind of looked at each other like, well, what do you mean it's too dangerous? We know it's dangerous, but how are we supposed to take down the Cali cartel if we can't go to Cali? And they kind of anticipated our response. They said, well, you're going to have to do it from Bogota. It's like, well,
Hmm.
that's not a very viable strategy to try to take down the Cali cartel from Bogota. But we then found out they told us that there were two other agents, Hispanic agents, that were there prior to us arriving in Colombia who had worked in Cali. And the cartel, as we call them, their intelligence arm of the Cali cartel, we refer to them as the Cali KGB. It's a reference to the KGB, the
Hmm.
notorious security agency in Russia. And these two agents had their photograph taken while they were coming out of a meeting with one of their sources. And it turns out that the source was, for lack of a better term, a double agent, right? He was giving information to these guys in DEA, but he was also an employee of the cartel, and he figured, well, Cali is going to pay me more money than the DEA is. So he kind of betrayed the agents, and the photograph made its way back to the embassy. And obviously, as you know, the knee-jerk reactions that we have in the government, it was seen as an implied threat against any DEA agents or CIA case officers working in Cali. So from that point on, nobody was allowed to go to Cali because of the danger. And when you look back in the late 80s and early 90s, Colombia was the most dangerous and the most violent country in the world. It led the world in homicides, it led the world in kidnappings. So it was a very dangerous place to be, especially for somebody like myself and Dave, right? I'm a good 6'2.5". Dave's a good 6'3.5". He looks like he could play tight end in the NFL. So there's no camouflaging us, right? There's no way we could disguise ourselves working in Cali. And Cali at the time, there was zero American presence. There were no Americans there whatsoever because of the danger, because of the cartel. They had a stranglehold on the city. So anybody who appeared with a gringo look, a gringo face, was immediately identified, whether right or wrong, as DEA or CIA. So there was nowhere to hide. People saw you, they immediately assumed that you were with DEA. So it made our job very difficult. We had to work a lot of times at night, under the cover of darkness. We had to work sometimes unilaterally to avoid the corruption. We always wore hats and sunglasses so we didn't have our photos taken, or at least clear ones taken. So that was pretty much the environment that we had to operate in when we showed up. So it was difficult.
And you mentioned corruption. So I might as well get into it here at this point. Can you describe the level of corruption in that country in law enforcement and military? I don't know if you can guesstimate a percentage, or how do you know who you can trust, and how do you successfully conduct investigations in that type of environment?
Well, that's a loaded question with multiple prongs. And let me start out by just saying this. In the book, After Escobar, we are very critical of the corruption that existed in Colombia at the time. We cite numerous instances. We, name names. It's pretty well known who these people were. Um, so it was, and just saying that, and the number, I don't know how you can put a number to it, but it was in the thousands, and I'll give you examples of that. But before I get into that, again, we are super critical about the corruption that existed in Colombia at the time. And that being said, there were a lot of hardworking, honest men and women who worked within the Colombian security forces that wanted to do the right thing, that tried to do the right thing. And there were a lot of people that we worked with over our years there who paid the ultimate price and got killed while trying to do that.
Right.
But
I don't want
the
to
problem,
I don't want to imply that everybody was corrupt at all, but great point that you made there.
yeah. But the problem is that no matter what group that you work with, and you can name the number, whether it's five, a group of five, a group of 10, a group of 25 special operators, especially in Cali, the cartel had every institution, every law enforcement entity penetrated. So, and it only takes one, and that's the point I'm trying to make. It only takes one or two well-placed people in each of those groups, or each of those security forces, or those institutions to completely subvert or sabotage or destroy an operation that you're working with. The 25 people you're working with could be honest, but if you got one in there, it can destroy everything.
This episode of the Right to Remain Silent podcast is brought to you by Streetwise 360 Law Enforcement Consulting, your go-to resource for expert law enforcement training. Whether it's conducting successful criminal investigations, performing undercover work, mastering interviews, conducting surveillance, utilizing confidential informants, or case strategy, Streetwise 360 gives officers the real-world skills they need for success. Learn more at streetwise-360.com, because knowledge is power in the field. Now back to the show.
And as a result of that, and we got criticism for this over the past, in the past, but As a result of that, we had to operate and assume that everybody was corrupt because there was no other way to get the job done. We had over and over and over a year on the ground, countless operations compromised, and they were obviously compromised, and we know they were compromised. You see on TV, you get the half-eaten piece of toast, but nobody's there. The coffee's still steaming, but there's nobody in the house. Things like that. And then over time, we started to get information as well that, hey, that operation was compromised before you got there. So we had to operate under that assumption. Again, we received criticism for that, but that's okay, to protect our sources, to protect our assets, to protect the integrity of the investigation. That's pretty much the way we had to operate. Uh, as far as numbers of corrupt people that they had, it was in the thousands. There's no way to put a finite number on that.
Right.
Now, people might say, "Hey, that seems kind of extreme, the thousands." Well, I'll give you a perfect example. In one raid that we did in July of 1995, we recovered three, and this is pretty well portrayed in Narcos season 3 in one of the episodes where we find a desk in the apartment of Miguel Rodriguez, and it has a hidden compartment in the desk. And we're able to break open the desk, and we find three leather briefcases concealed within that hidden compartment in the desk. Now, how you can construct a hidden compartment in the desk, I still don't know to this day. We couldn't find it. The only way we find it is we had to break the desk open before we found it. And we uncovered these explosive documents, which talked about corruption. It talked about Cali Cartel's campaign contributions to the 1994 presidential election there, which totaled in excess of $6 million. In those briefcases alone, on one raid, there were over 2,800 names of corrupt individuals that were found.
That's
That was in
incredible.
one seizure, one place, at one time. So obviously there were many others that weren't contained in those documents, but that just gives you an example of, and now they stemmed from politicians, police, military, prosecutors, journalists, people in the banking institutions, countrywide and institution wide throughout Colombia. But still, that amount of corrupt individuals who were on the payroll it was very hard to comprehend.
Yeah, you hit on something very striking there in that description. And not only do they have corrupt individuals on their payroll, but they have essentially every resource that they would need to successfully operate as a cartel. And just your description there made me think of this. I'm assuming they had like specialists or professionals like architects or engineers to construct a desk component like that, or safe places or things like that. So you're fighting this uphill battle where these guys have every resource available to them. It's just shocking. I'm stating that just so listeners can comprehend what you're dealing with down there.
The carpenters and the architects that the cartel employed were phenomenal. Not only were they building these kinds of compartments, we call them caletas, these hidden compartments in desks, they were also building these caletas, hiding places for the cartel leaders themselves. So they would be behind walls, like secret passages. And some of the ones that we found were so well constructed. We marveled at them after we found them because had we not had prior intelligence or done operations the way that we did them, there I would still be there 30 years later in some of those apartments, knocking on walls and hitting the walls with a hammer, the ceilings, the floors, because there's no way, if you didn't have advanced intel as to where they were at, or you got in there quick enough before they could access those compartments, you would never ever find them. They were uh, amazing just to see how they were constructed. And again, like I said, they were behind walls, they were behind furniture, so wall units, drawer, anything that you could, under jacuzzis, anything that you could imagine. And the carpenters and the architects were extremely skilled and did a fantastic job at building them.
Man, that's mind-blowing stuff. Okay, so you're working with various assets and confidential informants, and you're working with local authorities, and you're conducting search warrants and interviews. How does this progress for you? How do you continue to move along with those targets in mind? How does this unfold?
Dave and I were on the ground for almost 1 year, and we continually talked about, look, we have to have another approach as to how we're going to go after these guys because we were assigned to work with, and this is very well outlined in Narcos and some of these other programs you see. We were assigned to work with the search block, right? So the police had a search block and the military had a search block. And these search blocks were created during the days of Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel. And they were designed with these police and military special operators. And they were designed to go after the biggest and the baddest narco traffickers or kingpins in Colombia. So we really didn't have a choice as to who we could work with. You had to work with that police search block we were assigned with. We had to work with the military search block. And over time, as we had talked about, the operations were getting compromised and we were very frustrated. So we started to work unilaterally. We started to go out on our own and do our own surveillances, talk with our informants, face to face a lot more, get more information. And one of the key points is at the time, DEA didn't have any vetted units that we worked with. These were these specialized units that were polygraphed, they were drug tested, they had their backgrounds thoroughly scoured, they had undergone extensive training in the US. The DEA didn't have any of those units. So we had to work with units assigned to the intelligence community, right, to the CIA. They had access to those units. So, right at about that same time, or at that same time, we started to recruit a couple of very, very high level, well placed assets within the cartel that were giving us real time and actionable intelligence about the cartel leaders. And we decided that the only way that we were going to be effective to do this was to use these special units assigned to the intelligence community that were based in Bogota. They weren't even based in Cali. So we had to basically bring them overland and do our surveillances and our operations independent from the search block. We couldn't share information with the search block because they were thoroughly compromised. And as a result of us recruiting these high level assets, one, using these units assigned to the intelligence community, and three, with us working kind of unilaterally and against every protocol and rule and policy that were designed for us not to do that, we had to do that. And those three things pretty much started to have an immediate impact on our operations in Cali.
Can you share, I'm not asking for names and anything identifiable at all, but these high level assets within that organization, can you share what compelled them to cooperate or share information? Were they working off potential charges? Were they financial gain? Can you even address that?
Sure, I can address that. And I'll refer to three or four of the high level assets that we worked with. And their motivations were pretty much all different. Um, the first two, back in a few months before we actually arrested the first Cali cartel leader. So, say 2 or 3 months before, the Colombian government put out these massive rewards for the arrest of the cartel leaders. So, the four heads of the Cali cartel we refer to as the Godfathers, Miguel Rodriguez and Gilberto Rodriguez, two brothers. Their reward was the equivalent of about $1.75 million each for their
Hmm.
heads. 1.75 million US dollars back in 1994. It's quite a bit of money. The other two leaders, Jose Santa Cruz, Chepi Santa Cruz, was equivalent of about $625,000, and Pacho Herrera was about the same, $625,000. So, the first two sources that we had were pretty much motivated by money, by the rewards. The second high level asset that we had was he had got himself into a bind with the cartel that he got in, and this is very well outlined in the book as well. Um, he got into the cartel to assist in trying to take down or kill Pablo Escobar. And as a result, once Pablo was killed, when he tried to get out of the cartel, obviously it's like the mafia, you can't leave, right? After 6 years in the cartel, you've seen a lot, you know a lot, you've heard a lot, you're a liability. There's no way to leave. So he was in a position where he was pretty much trapped. He had no other resource or way to get out of the cartel. So, the old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, came into play. So we were able to establish contact with him and, try to take down one of the leaders of the Cali Cartel. And in exchange, he wanted to get out of the cartel, get into the US, and go into the witness security program, into WITSEC. The last one, uh, he was basically had an order out on him by the cartel to kill him. He didn't have any other choice but to pretty much come to us. We made a couple approaches to his wife and to some family members, and laid out exactly what was going to happen to him if he did not come and play ball on our side. So he saw the light. He knew what was going to happen. So we were able to recruit him, just so that he didn't get killed. So there were various different motivations for these guys or girls working with us. And again, in this case, they were all different.
Okay, that's super interesting. As you progress along here, is there as your investigation unfolds, is there a point in time where Chris realizes, man, we're really onto these. We really have something substantial here. We've got some teeth. And if so, how did you proceed from there?
Yes, that's exactly what happened. And again, it goes back to the assets that we had. We had two independent assets that we talked to who were giving us the exact same information about Gilberto Rodriguez and the way that we could actually get to him and find him. So once we talked to those two people who didn't know each other, their information was exactly the same. And we knew now that we had an entity and a specialized unit that we could trust to go after these guys, because this first operation was an extensive surveillance operation. It required us to follow an individual from point A to hopefully point B, which is where Gilberto was living. And the only way we could do that was with this specialized unit assigned to the intel community. So once we had the unit and we had that information, we knew it was just a matter of time, unless we completely on us, we destroyed the surveillance or we burnt it, that we were going to get to Gilberto Rodriguez.
How did that unfold? How did you guys get there?
Just exactly the way I described it. We were able to, one of the sources was able to arrange a meeting with a secretary, like an executive assistant for Gilberto. We followed him back to an apartment complex that he lived in Southern Cali. The information we had was that he, on a daily basis, would go to wherever Gilberto was staying at and, answer the phones, deliver messages, set up meetings, coordinate stuff for him. And the sources told us, hey, if you follow this guy, he'll lead you to Gilberto. And that's exactly what we did. It took us about a week to follow him, and we were able to put him down in a house just north of Central Cali. And we raided the house and found Gilberto in one of those hidden rooms.
Is that the scene portrayed in season three when he's in like a hot tub hidden?
Correct, but he wasn't in a hot tub. He was in some other type of caleta. There was an instance where there was a caleta under the jacuzzi, but I think for that scene, the Narcos writers thought it would be better for the jacuzzi to come out there. But yeah, that was exactly there. The surveillance happened, differently than it's portrayed in the show. But yeah, that's exactly how we got there.
Okay. So then once he's taken into custody, how does it progress from there? Is it kind of a domino effect? Is there a long time frame before the rest of the individuals are taken into custody? How does that work?
You must have been reading like a sneak preview of the book, because I have a chapter in there called The Domino Effect, and
Ah,
it does take place after Gilberto's arrest. So to put it in context, we're on the ground almost a year. Nothing really happens, right? Operations are compromised. We're frustrated. We're trying to think of ways that we can go after these guys. What other units, different MOs to go about it. And then you have June, July, and August of 1995, and it's like a tidal wave. It's a tsunami. So Gilberto gets arrested. Actually, to 30 years ago today, Gilberto is arrested, June the 9th.
wow, how ironic.
Ironic, right? Everything at that point for the next 3 months moves incredibly fast. July 4th, so almost a month, just under a month later, the other Godfather, Jose Santa Cruz, Chepi Santa Cruz. We have information from, I have to be careful here. We have information from an asset that Chepe is in Bogota trying to negotiate a surrender to the Colombian government. The Colombian National Police also have information that Santa Cruz is negotiating with his lawyers and with government officials to surrender himself. So the information is corroborated. And as a result of that, and there's some other details as well, that the National Police start to send these plainclothes police officers out to these restaurants and these high-end upscale bars in northern Bogota, because Santa Cruz has the reputation of, only eating the finest steak and drinking the finest wine and liquor. So they start scouring this northern quadrant of Bogota, just checking restaurants because they have some other prior intel. And sure enough, they walk into a restaurant. It's actually my favorite steak place in Colombia, my favorite restaurant in Colombia. It's called Carbon de Palo. It's in northern Bogota. And when these undercover plainclothes officers walk in, they see Jose Santa Cruz sitting in the back with a couple other people, eating a steak and drinking his wine. And they basically arrest him in the restaurant. Now, there were a lot of rumors and a lot of controversy about the rest, that um, he was going to surrender the next day, but by doing that and eating in such a high profile place, it was like embarrassing. I mean, because this guy is well known, right? His pictures everywhere. It's not like he can go into a restaurant, let alone one of the most popular restaurants in Colombia, and sit there and have a meal without somebody recognizing him, right? It just doesn't
right.
make any sense. So, anyway, whatever you want to believe on that, I have my own theories. He gets arrested in the restaurant, and boom, you have two down. That's July. Then in August, we have operations that take place where we're able to arrest Miguel Rodriguez, the third godfather of the Cali Cartel. And actually, he was running the cartel at the time. He was the ultimate head in August of '95. So there's extensive operations that happened, very intricate operations, and they're very well outlined in the book as to what we did and how we did it and why we did what we did. So he goes down in August. So those 3 months, boom, 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 you have three of the major Cali cartel leaders go down. And then it's not 1 year later, 13 months later, that finally Pacho Herrera, the last remaining godfather standing, he surrenders to the police in September of 1996. So all four are down by September '96.
Okay. Man, that's fascinating. In addition to these four Godfathers, were there numerous, I can only assume, were there numerous other arrests as well in Colombia and the United States? And I'm not asking for exact numbers, but
Hundreds, hundreds. There were rewards that were offered by the Colombian government detailed seven of the top Cali cartel leaders. So we talked about the four Godfathers. There were three other ones there that also had a $625,000 reward. Henry Loaiza, Victor Patino, and Fenor Arizabaleta. They actually, let's see, Fenor surrendered. Loaiza surrendered. But also all three of those guys surrendered as well because in Colombia, if you surrender to justice in Colombia, you can get a third off your sentence for the ultimate act of surrendering, and you can get a third off your sentence for cooperating with the government. So in essence, you
Oh,
can get
wow.
2/3 off your sentence. So there are incentives for these guys to surrender. And a lot of times too, these deals are cut where they let them keep all their assets. They do 4 or 5 years in jail. They come out, they still have millions or billions of dollars. It's a pretty good deal. Um, so there were a lot of them that did that as well. There were multiple others that were arrested in Colombia. There were multiple people arrested in the United States as well as Europe and other countries. In the U.S. alone, there was a major investigation called Operation Cornerstone. It was a joint back then customs and DEA investigation
I
into the
was a
Cali
former
Cartel.
customs agent, and that
Yeah,
rings very true. Yes, sir.
it was a phenomenal investigation, and one of the customs agents that worked on that case was Ed Kazarowski, who was very helpful and very was integral in us going after the cartel and pursuing some of the leads. Again, a customs agent, and that joint operation between customs and DEA resulted in the indictment and arrest of I probably pretty close to 100 people and the seizure of over 100,000 pounds of cocaine. So that was a major investigation. And of course, every DEA office, customs office, FBI office in the major cities in the US, they all had, investigations going on into Cali too. And they had operatives in pretty much every country in Central America, South America, and Europe. So they were continually being arrested over there. So yeah, they suffered significant setbacks and arrests by law enforcement throughout the world.
Yeah, man, that's a great point that you made for listeners to understand is not only are you at essentially ground zero in Colombia conducting these investigations and arrests, but simultaneously law enforcement in the United States is kind of doing the reverse investigation as well. So you're almost crossing paths and covering everything very thoroughly. That's a great point that you made there. Did many of these individuals go to trial?
The ones arrested in the US, I would say most of them probably did not. They pled guilty, but what it did was Cali had cells and they had cell heads in pretty much every major US city in the United States at the time. So when you would take down some of these cell heads in Miami or New York, they had extensive information and they were looking at a lot of time because Operation Cornerstone started as a result of a 12 and a half ton seizure of cocaine. So 24,000 pounds of cocaine that had been shipped from Venezuela into South Florida in hollowed out concrete fence posts. And as a result of that seizure and people arrested, that Cornerstone case took off. So when you arrested a lot of these major cell heads or these significant players that were operating in the US, they're looking at substantial time. I mean, if you're getting sentenced behind, 24,000 pounds of cocaine, you're going to jail for a long time. And, they had no other recourse or no other option except to cooperate. So they started to provide a lot of this really good intelligence about the cartel leaders, about their distribution outlets in not only the US, but in these other countries. So, as we say, it had the domino effect. You had this information, operations would take place, more seizures of cash, and loads of cocaine would be seized. And as a result, these operatives arrested.
Wow. And maybe you can't answer this one. In those months that after the initial arrest of the Godfather, when you're pursuing the rest of them, it's alluded to in the Netflix here in Narcos that wire intercepts are occurring throughout the investigation. I'm assuming there was massive panic in this organization after this first takedown and then in those following months until everyone was taken down. Is that a fair statement?
Sure, because when these people are taken down in the US, right, it's not like they're arrested in Colombia and they could go to these prisons where they live in these luxury rooms and they have chefs and they have maids and they have cell phones and they can do pretty much anything that they want. When you're arrested in the US behind those kind of charges, you're going to jail for a long time, and the federal prison system for some of these facilities is not the best, and those guys know it. So uh, these cartel leaders and these other major players expected, or they knew that these guys were going to cooperate. So there was a lot of panic, and there were multiple superseding indictments that came out of Operation Cornerstone. So they were continually looking over their shoulder. They were worried, and we talked about the vulnerabilities of the cartel, right? The problems that they had. Transportation, communication was another huge vulnerability and problem for the cartel, because imagine you're sitting in Colombia trying to run a worldwide, and they were worldwide at the time, network and operation with people in all of these different countries throughout the world. You have to be able to communicate. You have to be able to use the telephone. You got to be able to use the fax. You got to be able to use pagers and so on and so forth. So communications were a big vulnerability for the cartel, which law enforcement exploited.
Yeah, great point. And for younger listeners out there, I think they need to realize that we didn't, back in that time frame that you were doing these investigations, there weren't private apps like Signal and, Snapchat and all these various ways of communication. So that's a great point, mentioning the vulnerability of communications with these organizations. Is there anything else about the investigative aspect here that we haven't covered that you think is important to discuss?
Well, I mean, DEA's bread and butter has always been human sources and assets. And you brought up a good point nowadays with all these encrypted apps. It's hard for law enforcement to penetrate some of these communications because of the encryption. Um, back then they were using voice changing machines, and they were only communicating with cell heads and these bigger people, but human sources and assets, whether you're going after a drug trafficking organization, an arms trafficking organization, a terrorist cell like Al Qaeda, the only way that these major players are going to be taken down anymore is either by dumb luck or accident, or by utilizing those assets to be able to infiltrate and provide law enforcement with real-time actionable intelligence. And that was really the key for us, and for the Colombian government as well, to have access to those sources, to be able to tell you, what these guys were doing, where they were at, who they were meeting with, how they were doing stuff. So, um, yeah, it's super important now in any kind of investigation to have those sources.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly. That's a great point uh, to make. Let me ask this: after everyone was apprehended, and the takedown of the Godfathers, and people went through their court and sentencing, and the dust settled after this. How long did you remain in Colombia? Like you were there for a large, a good chunk of your career, right? How long after this did you remain there?
So, a good question. The first time we were there almost 3 years. So we were there from 94 to 97. And even though the four Cali leaders were taken down and the organization was pretty much decimated by then, you had another cartel which was starting to come to the forefront and rise up, which was the North Valley Cartel. The Cali Cartel still remained in existence. They were led by William Rodriguez, who was Miguel Rodriguez's son, although they were not nearly as powerful, obviously, as they were. But there was still a lot of investigation to do. They still had, thousands and thousands and thousands of assets that needed to be identified and seized. And we had to work in conjunction with a number of federal U.S. agencies as well as the government of Colombia. So that financial investigation and the seizure of assets went on for years. But as far as our first tour, myself, Dave, there were two other agents that worked with us in Cali, Jerry Salome and Ruben Prieto. We were all gone by mid 1997 for 3 years. So I went back to Colombia two subsequent times to work on the financial aspect of the Cali Cartel as well as the North Valley Cartel. My second tour, I did just over 3 years there as well. And then I went back a third time to work on the paramilitaries, the AUC, and a couple of other transnational organized crime groups in 2004 to 2010. So I did three separate tours in Colombia that totaled over 12 years.
Okay. Once you concluded your time in Colombia after those 12 years, where did you transition to and where did you finish out your career at?
The first time I left Colombia, I went to Washington, D.C. I was promoted and I went into the Mexico and Central America section as a coordinator of operations and stuff out of our headquarters in Washington, D.C. I then went back to Bogota as a supervisor for 3 years, a little over 3 years. I then transferred back to the U.S. domestically for a cup of coffee, and then I went back as the assistant regional director of the Andean region. And I did that for 6 years, and then I ultimately ended up in Phoenix, Arizona as an assistant special agent in charge. I retired out of Phoenix in 2014.
Okay. Okay. Well, and maybe this is a silly question, but I'm curious, so I'll ask it. Would you do it all over again, the way that you did it originally, your
I
career?
would I would do everything the same except promote.
I've heard that a lot.
Yeah, because that's why you get into the law enforcement field, especially with DEA. You like the field work, right? You like working on the street. Working in Colombia was at that time in 94 to 97 against the Cali Cartel, living in Cali, staying with the police, living in safe houses. Your closest backup technically was 200 miles away. You were on your own. I mean, that was a great time to be working there. And and this very well, is that the higher you go up in the ranks, the more bureaucracy you're exposed to, and the further and further you get away from that field work or that street work. And I didn't like sitting behind a desk. I didn't like wearing a suit and tie. I didn't like dealing with a lot of that stuff. So if I had it to do over again, I think I would have just remained a senior, street agent as we call them, or field agent, and just done that and gone back and
Yeah.
forth to Colombia or other countries and kind of did the same thing without promoting.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. Um, how about if you don't mind, can we shift to a discussion of the Narcos series? Self-admittedly, I wasn't familiar, I had heard of it. Everybody I worked with, all my buddies love it and they've watched it and they're always telling me, you need to watch this show, you need to watch this show. And just for whatever reason, I never did. But I gotta say, when you and I connected and we scheduled, our episode for today, I binge watched season three. So I'm kind of prefacing my questions here. Um, Maybe displaying my lack of knowledge about the entire series, but how did that series come about on Netflix and how did you get involved with it? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yep, great question.
Okay.
So Netflix had the idea to do Narcos and to do the show about Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel. And when they started to do their research or they needed to get information, there were only two people they could reach out to, right? And that was Javier Pena and Steve Murphy, the two DEA agents who were there in Colombia at the time, who worked with the Colombian government to help take down Pablo. So they reached out to them. They, they did their debriefings, they did their research, and they came up with the show Narcos, which focused on season 1 and 2 of Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel. So jumping forward, they Netflix saw what a hit they had on their hands, right? Because Netflix does a great job in anything they do. They research the topic thoroughly. They have excellent writers. They don't really pinch a lot of pennies when it comes to making these shows. So they 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 do everything the right way, so to say. And the next logical evolution for that series of Narcos was to go into season three, which was the Cali Cartel. So when they started to, look into that, they asked Steve and Javier, "Hey, who would be a good person to talk to about Cali because that's where we want to go next." And in doing their and they threw out my name. They said, "Hey, you should talk to Chris Feistl. He's retired. He can give you some background on the Cali Cartel." And in doing their research, they also listened to an interview, a show that I did back in 2012, I think it was, on NPR, National Public Radio, called This American Life with Ira Glass. And that radio interview talked about Jorge Salcedo, who was one of the key players in the Narcos series and also with us in helping take down, Miguel Rodriguez and the Cali Cartel. And there was a book written by William Rempel. So it's an outstanding book, highly recommended, called At the Devil's Table, which outlines Jorge Salcedo's life in the employ of the Cali Cartel. And as we were talking about, there's a part in his life and in the book and in the series where we joined forces with Salcedo. So we participated in Bill's book, fairly extensively toward the end. So they wanted to bring us together, myself and the author of the book, William Rempel, to do this radio program. And so we did that, and Netflix had heard, the Narcos people had heard that interview, and then they reached out to me after Javier and Steve's recommendation. So I spoke to them. I went out to California, sat down with the writers, some of the Netflix staff, and kind of just went over everything that happened, kind of like we're doing here. This, but in a lot more detail. This happened, how that happened, and they started to gradually form a plan to do Narcos season three.
And you were a consultant on that season, right?
I was a
Throughout the
consultant.
season.
Yes, I was a consultant on season three, and my character is portrayed in season three by actor Michael Stahl-David, who did a great job as Chris Feistl. My partner Dave Mitchell is portrayed as Daniel Van Ness. They didn't use his real name because at the time Dave was still active and working with the DEA, so they had to come up with an undercover name for Dave.
Gotcha. Well, you beat me to the punch. I was going to ask, were you pleased with the portrayal of you in the series and the actor that did so?
Yeah, no, Michael did a great job. He's a very good actor. And what was cool about the series too was just going down there, being on set for some of the filming, going over some of the scripts, going out to some of the actual locations where events happened, like right in the same spot was pretty cool. And as I always say, working with Netflix was a pleasure. It was great. I had a really good time doing that, and just being in Cali all those years later and seeing the city was pretty cool. And just being able to hang out with a lot of the actors and talk about stuff and go over things was a lot of fun.
I bet that was surreal. I bet that was a great experience, like you said. Well, let's kind of transition to your book, After Escobar. Can you share with listeners details about the book? What compelled you and your partner to write this book? When it's available? I think it's June 24th, but I don't want to misspeak. Just fill us in on that.
So yeah, first question, June 24th is the official release date of the book. It's available now for pre-order on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. So you can pre-order it now. We also have a website, www.afterescobar.com. You can order the book from, and it will be delivered, the 24th or after. Um, but it was a perfect segue because, as I mentioned, Dave was still active during the filming and the creation of Narcos season three. and he didn't retire until, early 2022. And after he retired, we did a podcast, and we got some pretty good feedback on it. And he said, we should write a book about what happened and cover the whole story from start to finish, and exactly what happened and how it happened, and what we did. And I wasn't really too keen on the idea. I had a couple other things that I was working on, and he kept pushing me, come on, let's do it, let's do it. So we finally agreed to do it. And that was the motivation for behind the book. It was pretty much Dave driving that to get it done. And we sat down, we hammered it out. We had a lot of good support and help from one of our collaborators, Jessica Balboni, on the book. So I think it worked out pretty good. I think anybody who's a fan of Narcos, obviously, of true crime, nonfiction stories. There's a lot of action in there. We don't pull any punches. We tell it exactly. It's not political in any way whatsoever. It's pretty much the story from our POV, right? From our point of view. This is what
Yeah.
happened. This is what we did. This is why we did what we did. These are some of the bad things that happened. These are some of the good things that happened. And it just outlines pretty much the whole story from start to finish, as well as a lot of history about events that happened during that time. The in the political arena, history about the Cali Cartel, the Medellin Cartel, the war, the brutal 6-year war between Cali and Medellin. So there's an awful lot of detail in there about that at the time in Colombia during the late 80s and the early 90s.
Yeah, I'm on the pre-order list. I'm looking forward to it, and I would encourage the listeners to, like you said, I'm confident we don't have the time to share every detail in a brief conversation like this. So there is a myriad of more information in this book. So I would just encourage people that are interested in this topic to get that book. And like I said, I'm looking forward to it. Um, let me ask you this: as a career DEA agent that's traveled the world and worked major, investigations, would you have any helpful suggestions for young people that are interested in a career in law enforcement that you might be able to share with them?
Hmm, that's a great question. Get your college degree. Most places now, most agencies will require a college degree. Learn a language. You know, Obviously Spanish was highly beneficial. It's a necessity if you're working in Central or South America. But DEA has offices now, and I think upwards of 90 different countries. So you can go to a variety of different places, which require different languages for you to learn. Uh, those are two of the things that I would highly recommend. Also, get some experience too, if you can. Do an internship with a federal law enforcement agency or the U.S. Attorney's Office. Anything like that is helpful.
Yeah, I think that's some of the best advice. I'll ask each guest on each episode. That's some of the best advice that I've heard somebody give. So, Chris, I really want to thank you for taking the time to speaking with me today and sharing your story. And I greatly appreciate what you did and your efforts to take down this organization. And people appreciate all the work that you put in, and I know I do. So again, thank you.
Thank you for having me on. And the real credit goes to the Colombian government and the Colombian law enforcement and security services, who, as we said earlier, they've sacrificed. No one has sacrificed more than the country of Colombia during the war on drugs and the war on terrorism, which they faced down there. And just the other day, they had one of their I think it was one of their senators was shot at a rally
Mhm.
in Bogota. So they're the real heroes in this. And we say in law enforcement too. Timing is everything. I was fortunate to be in at the right place at the right time, and a lot of different things. So it's you can't complain about that.
Yeah, well said. Well, let me transition to my listeners. I just want to say, as usual, thank you for listening in. And please continue to like and follow, share, and subscribe to my social media so I can continue to bring you top caliber, interesting guests like, retired DEA agent Chris Feistl to the show. So thank you to the listeners, and thanks again to Chris, and everybody stay safe out there. The Right to Remain Silent podcast is brought to you by Streetwise 360 Studios. I would like to again thank today's guest for sharing the story right here on the podcast. Please remember to like, follow, share, and recommend us so that I can continue to bring you high caliber guests sharing their experiences just like we heard today. If your law enforcement agency is interested in training provided by Streetwise 360, or if you know someone that has an interesting law enforcement story to share, please contact me via the website, www.streetwise-360.com, www.streetwise-360.com.